Good morning. Welcome back. We last left them. They were hearing the Morgles chant, and I think they're like 100 meters. Whoopsie. Sorry. Oh boy. They were 100 meters away. So we're going to find out exactly what's going to happen pretty quick. Okay, so I really need to invent a better way to do this with my phone. All right. Well, it's a little crooked, but deal with it. Will and Horace both turned quickly to look at her. Wargles? How do you know? Will asked. I've heard them before, she said in a small voice, biting her lip. They make that chanting sound as they march. Will frowned. The 4 Wargles he and Halt had tracked had made no chanting sound, but then he realized those Wargles had been tracking their own quarry at the time. Out of the corner of his eye, Will saw a movement at the bend in the road. Get down, he hissed urgently. Keep your faces down, and both Horace and Evelyn dropped their faces into the sand. He reached up and pulled the shadowing depths of his cowl further over his own face, then held a forearm draped at the folds of his cloak to obscure everything but his eyes. So he's kind of like doing this. The chant he saw now was a form of cadence designed to keep the Wargles moving at the same pace, in the same way a sergeant might call the steps for a troop of infantry. He counted perhaps 30 in the group, big, heavy-set figures dressed in dark metal-studded jackets and breeches of some heavy material. They ran at a steady jog, chanting the guttural, wordless rhythm, which he realized now was nothing more than a series of grunts. They were all armed with an assortment of short spears, maces, and battle axes, which they carried ready for use. As yet, he couldn't make out their features. They ran with a shambling movement in 2 files. Then he realized that they were escorting another group between the 2 files. Prisoners. Now that the group was closer, he realized that the prisoners, about a dozen of them, were staggering along, trying desperately to keep pace with the chanting Wargles. He recognized them as Celts, miners, judging by the leather aprons and skull caps they wore. They were exhausted, and as he watched, he could see the Wargles using short whips to urge them on. The chanting grew louder. What's happening? Horace whispered, and Will could have cheerfully choked him. Shut up! He shot back. Not another word. Now the Wargles were closer, and he could make out their faces. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to rise as he saw the thick, heavy jowls and noses that had lengthened and thickened almost to the size of muzzles. The eyes were small and savage and seemed to glow with a red hatred as they lashed their whips at the Celts. Once, as one of them snarled at a stumbling prisoner, Will caught a quick glimpse of yellow fangs. He was tempted to shrink down further, but he knew any movement now would risk discovery. He had to trust the shelter of his cloak. He wanted to close his eyes to those animal-like faces, but somehow he couldn't. He stared in fascinated horror as the terrible Wargles, creatures from a nightmare, chanting incessantly, jogged past the spot where he lay. The Celt miner couldn't have lost his footing at a worse place. Lashed by one of the Wargles, he stumbled, staggered, then crashed over in the road, bringing down the prisoners on either side of him. Will could see now that they were roped together with a thick rawhide leash. As the column came to a confused stop, the chanting broke up into a series of snarls and growls from the Wargles. The 2 prisoners who had been brought down struggled to their feet under a rain of lashes from their captors. The miner who had caused the fall lay still, in spite of the vicious whipping from one of the Wargles. Finally, another joined the first and began beating at the still figure with the butt of his heavy steel-shod spear. There was no reaction from the miner. Watching in horror, Will realized that the man was dead. Eventually, that same realization came to the Wargles. At an incomprehensible command from one who must have been in charge, the 2 stopped beating the dead man and cut the bonds that attached him to the central leash. Then they picked up the limp body and threw it clear, hurling it toward the thicket where Will and the others were sheltered. The body crashed into the bushes closest to the road, and Will heard Evelyn utter a small cry of fear. Face down, not knowing what was happening, the sudden crashing in the bushes near her had obviously been too much for her to bear. She bit the noise off almost as soon as it started, but she was just a little too late. The leader of the Wargles seemed to have heard something. He turned now and stared hard at the spot where the body lay, wondering if the noise had come from the miner. Obviously, he was suspicious that the dead man might be merely foxing in an effort to escape. He pointed and shouted an order, and the Wargle with the spear stepped forward and ran it casually through the dead body. Still, the commander's suspicions weren't satisfied. For a long moment, he stared into the bushes, looking straight at the spot where Will lay, wrapped in the protective camouflage of his ranger cloak. The apprentice found himself staring deep into the angry red eyes of the savage thing on the road. He wanted to drop his eyes away from the gaze, convinced that the creature could see him. But all of Halt's training over the past year told him that any movement now would be fatal, and he knew that dropping his eyes could lead to a tiny, involuntary movement of his head. The true value of the camouflage cloaks lay not in magic, as so many people believed, but in the wearer's ability to remain unmoving under close scrutiny. Forcing himself to believe, Will remained motionless, staring at the wargle. His mouth was dry, his heart pounded at what seemed like twice its normal rate. He could hear the heavy, rasping breathing of the bear-like figure, see the nostrils twitching slightly as it sampled the light breeze, testing for unknown scents. Finally, the wargle turned away. Then, in an instant, it whipped back again to stare once more. Fortunately, Will's training had covered that particular trick as well. He made no movement. This time, the wargle grunted, then called an order to the group. Chanting once more, they moved out, leaving the dead miner on the roadside. As the sound receded and they disappeared around the next bend in the road, Will felt Horace moving behind him. "Stay still," he whispered fiercely. It was possible that the wargles had a sweeper following, a silent moving rear scout who might catch unwary fugitives who thought the danger was past. He forced himself to count to 100 before he allowed the others to move, crawling clear of the bushes and stretching their stiff and aching limbs. Signaling to Horace to take Evelyn back to the campsite, Will stepped cautiously into the road to check the Celt. As he had suspected, the man was dead. He was obviously been beaten many times over the past few days. His face was bruised and cut by the whips and fists of the wargles. There was nothing he could do for the man, so he left him where he lay and went to rejoin the others. Evelyn was sitting crying. As he approached, she looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and her shoulders heaving with the great sobs that shook her. Horace stood by, a helpless expression on his face, making useless little movements with his hands. "I'm sorry," Evelyn finally managed to gasp. "It's just that, chanting those voices, I could remember everything when they—" "It's all right," Will told her quietly. "My God, they're horrible creatures," he added, shaking his head at Horace. The warrior apprentice swallowed once or twice. He hadn't seen the wargles. He had lain there throughout the entire encounter with his face pressed hard into the sandy ground. In a way, thought Will, that must have been just as terrifying. "What are they like?" Horace asked in a small voice. Will shook his head again. It was almost impossible to describe. "Like beasts," he said. "Like bears, or a cross between a bear and a dog, but they walk upright like men." Evelyn gave another shuddering cry. "They're vile," she said bitterly. "Vile, horrible creatures. Oh, God, I hope I never see them again." Will moved to her and patted her shoulder awkwardly. "They're gone now," he said quietly, as if soothing a small child. "They're gone, and they can't hurt you." She made an enormous effort and gathered her courage. She looked up at him, a frightened smile on her face. She reached up and took his hand in her own, taking comfort from the mere contact. He let her hold her hand for a while. He wondered how he was going to tell them what he had decided to do. I wonder what he decided to do. I think I kind of know. What do you think? I think I know. Chapter 17. "Follow them? Are you out of your mind?" Horace stared at the small, determined figure, unable to believe what he was hearing. Will didn't say anything to Horace, so he tried again. "Will, we've just spent a half an hour hiding behind a bush, hoping those things wouldn't see us. Now you want to follow them and give them another chance?" Will glanced around to make sure that Evelyn was still out of earshot. He didn't want to alarm the girl unnecessarily. "Keep your voices down," he warned Horace, and his friend spoke more softly, but nonetheless vehemently. "Why?" he asked. "What can we possibly gain by following them?" Will shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. Frankly, the idea of following the wargles was already frightening them. He could feel his pulse rate was running higher than normal. They were terrifying creatures, and obviously totally devoid of any feelings of mercy or pity, as the fate of the prisoner had shown. Still, he could see that this was an opportunity that shouldn't be wasted. "Look," he said quietly, "Halt always told me that knowing why your enemy is doing something is just as important as knowing what he's doing. Sometimes more important, in fact. Horace shook his head stubbornly. I don't get it, he said. To him, this idea of Will's was crazy, irresponsible, and terrifyingly dangerous. To be truthful, Will wasn't absolutely sure that he was right either. But Galan's parting words about not showing uncertainty rang in his ears, and his instincts, honed by Halt's training, told him this was an opportunity he shouldn't miss. We know the Wargles are capturing Celtic miners and carrying them off, he said. And we know Morgrath doesn't do anything without a reason. This might be a chance to find out what he's up to. Horace shrugged. He wants slaves, he said, and Will shook his head quickly. But why? And why only miners? Evelyn said they were only interested in the miners. Why? Can't you see? He appealed to the bigger boy. This could be important. Halt says that wars are often turned on the smallest piece of information. Horace pursed his lips, thinking over what Will had said. And finally, he nodded slowly. Okay, he agreed. I guess you're maybe right. Horace wasn't a fast thinker or an original one, but he was methodical and, in his own way, logical. Will had instinctively seen the necessity for following the Wargles. Horace had to work his way through it. Now that he could see Will wasn't acting on some wild, adventurous impulse. He trusted the ranger apprentice's line of reasoning. Well, if we're going to follow them, we'd better get moving, he added, and Will looked at him in surprise, shaking his head. We, he said. Who said anything about we? I plan to follow them alone. Your job is to get Evelyn back safely. Says who? Said the bigger boy with some belligerence. My job, as it was explained to me by Galan, was to stay with you and keep you out of trouble. Well, I'm changing your orders, Will told him. But this time Horace laughed. So, who died and left you, boss? He scoffed. You can't change my orders. Galan gave me those orders and he outranks us. Or he outranks you. And what about the girl? Will challenged him. For a moment, Horace was stuck for an answer. We'll give her food and supplies in the pack horse, he said. She can make her own way back. That's very gallant of you, Will said sarcastically. Horace merely shook his head again, refusing to be baited into an argument on that score. You're the one who said this is so darned important, he replied. Well, I'm afraid I think you're right. So Evelyn will simply have to take her chances just like us. We're close to the border now anyway, and one more night's riding will see her out of Celtica. In truth, Horace didn't like the thought of leaving Evelyn to her own devices. He had grown genuinely fond of the girl. She was bright and amusing and good company. But his time in battle school had given him a strong sense of duty, and personal feelings came second. Will tried one more time. I can move a lot faster without you, he pointed out, but Horace cut him off immediately. So what? We won't need speed if we're following the Wargles. We've got horses. We'll have no trouble keeping up with them, particularly as they have to drag those prisoners along. He found he was rather enjoying the experience of arguing with Will and coming up with winning points. Maybe, he decided, spending time with the Rangers had done him more good than he had realized. Besides, what if we find out something really important? And what if you want to keep following them and we still have to get a message back to the Baron? If there are two of us, we can split up. I can take a message back while you keep following the Wargles. Will considered the idea. Horace had a point. He had to concede. It would make sense to have someone else along with him now that he thought about it. All right, he said finally, but we're going to have to tell Evelyn. Tell me what? The girl asked. Unnoticed by either of them, she had approached to within a few meters of where they had been standing, arguing in lowered voices. The two boys now looked guiltily at each other. Will had an idea, you see, Horace began, and then stopped, looking at Will to see if his friend was going to continue. But, as it turned out, there was no need. You're planning to follow the Wargles, the girl said flatly, and the two apprentices exchanged looks before Will answered. You were listening? He accused her, shook her head. She shook her head. No, it's the obvious thing to do, isn't it? This is our chance to find out what they're up to and why they're kidnapping the miners. For the second time in a few minutes, Will found himself picking up on the use of the plural. Our chance? He asked her. What exactly do you mean by our chance? Evelyn shrugged. Obviously, if you two are following them, I'm coming along with you. You're not leaving me out here on my own in the middle of nowhere. But, Horace began, and she turned to look calmly at him. These are wargles, he said. I gathered that. Horace cast a hopeless glance at Will. The apprentice ranger shrugged, so Horace tried again. It'll be dangerous. And you... He hesitated. He didn't want to remind her of her fear of the wargles and the reasons for it. Evelyn realized his predicament, and she smiled wanly at him. Look, I'm scared of those things, she said, but I assume you're planning to follow them, not join up with them. That was the general idea, Will said, and she turned her level gaze on him. Well, with the noise they make, we shouldn't have to get too close to them, she told him. And besides, this might be a chance to spoil whatever plans they have. I think I'd enjoy that. Will regarded her with a new respect. She had every reason to fear the wargles, more than he or Horace. Yet she was willing to put that fear aside in order to strike a blow against Morgarath. You're sure? He said finally, and she shook her head. No, I'm not sure at all. I feel decidedly queasy at the prospect of getting within earshot of those things again. But equally, I don't like the idea of being abandoned here on my own. We weren't abandoning you, Horace began, and she turned back to him. Then what would you call it? She asked him, smiling faintly to take the sting out of her words. He hesitated. Abandoning you, I guess, he admitted. Exactly, she said. So, given the choice of running into another group of wargles or more bandits or following some wargles with you two, I'll choose the latter. We're only a day from the border, Will pointed out to her. Once you're across that, you'll be relatively safe. But she shook her head decisively. I feel more secure with you two, she said. Besides, it might be handy for you to have someone else along. It'll be one more person to keep watch at night. That means you'll get more sleep. That's the first sensible reason I've heard for her coming along so far, said Horace. Like Will, he realized that she had made up her mind, and both boys somehow knew that when Evelyn did that, there was no way on earth they were going to make her change it. She grinned at him. At them. Well, she said, are we going to stand here all day nattering? Those wargles aren't getting any closer while we're doing it. And turning on their heel, she led the way to where the horses were tethered. All right, that's where I'm going to stop. I'm just kind of scanning ahead. So, all right, see you later. Have a good day.